And we'll go to the next questioner.
Maybe if we were to have a discourse, a wider discourse, are the MPs expendable? That might be a useful sounding board to get people used to more radical ideas. Because if they're not, then any idea of doing anything particularly radical is really just conversation. Until they themselves see them as expendable, surely there are issues there. But I'd like to hear your views on that, Craig.
Yeah, my current view is that there's no longer any point in having SNP MPs at Westminster. I don't think they should be there. It's perfectly legitimate exercise to fight the elections and accept the resources that come, as Sinn Féin does, I believe. But I don't think, plainly with an 80 Tory majority and with the entire current setup and when you've got a Prime Minister who doesn't think there's a border between England and Scotland, there's just no point in debating at Westminster. And I think withdrawing from the House of Commons as well as from the House of Lords, I certainly agree that that's something I think we should do, and would make plain we are serious about leaving the state. I also think we should be at the stage where we are no longer participating in debates about what the UK does in future, on the grounds we're not going to be in it. And my view on Brexit was, I don't think the SNP ever had any business to be trying to stop England and Wales from leaving the European Union. The people of England and Wales plainly voted to leave the EU. And if you take Scotland out of the equation, they voted to leave the EU by a fairly wide margin. If you believe in Scottish independence, then what right had we to try to stop England and Wales leaving the EU when England and Wales wanted to leave the EU? We should have been avoiding that debate and concentrating entirely on getting our independence in order so we could stay in the EU as we wanted and they could leave as they wanted, because that is the obvious solution. And I think we got dragged far too deeply into UK politics there. And I think, when you had Nicola Sturgeon down in London addressing anti-Brexit rally, I don't think the politics of London and Brexit are any of our business. So that's taking abstentionism further, if you like. I think we should be staying out of UK politics. And equally, I think people probably realise that I don't really accept the official UK government narrative on what happened in the Skripal case. I don't pretend I know what happened in the Skripal case. I don't. I think both the UK government is lying and I think the Russian government is lying. Exactly what happened, I don't pretend I know. But both narratives seem to me equally implausible. But the SNP were going on about the attacks on our country. Well, our country wasn't attacked, actually. If it was the Russians who attacked, and I don't think it was for the moment, but if it was the Russians who attacked, if that was a Russian attack, it was a Russian attack not in our country, it was a Russian attack in England. And I think we much too readily join into a UK narrative, which we should be much more explicit in saying is not our business, because it is not our state. And I think that, if you like, takes the abstentionist argument still further. So basically, I'm with you, but I don't. But when you're talking of Parnell, you're talking of using the tactic over decades, and I don't think we've got decades, but I would certainly support immediately withdrawing our MPs from Westminster.
In terms of international recognition, who are the members of the Security Council? And would they be inclined to stand up and support Scotland?
Well, the first thing says that it's a recognition as a General Assembly vote, not a Security Council vote. So it's everybody. But the Security Council has a kind of general power of veto on developments, which I don't think formally relates to recognition of states, but it has a very general power to intervene. The Security Council members, as I say, the key in both the General and the Security Council membership, it has 5 permanent members who are Russia, China, America, the UK, and France. Those are the permanent members. And there's 7 other members who rotate from all the other countries in the world. But rather more important is the general attitude of countries in the General Assembly. The position of the EU is going to be key because the EU countries are very influential. Who knows what the United States will do if Donald Trump is still president, but Donald Trump, of course, quite probably won't still be president after the end of this year. I think the attitude of the European Union will be the key determinant. And as I say, the European Union has a major incentive to recognize Scotland because the European Union, the whole dynamic of the European Union has always been expansion. The European Union is essentially an expansionist organization. That's why it allowed Bulgaria and Romania to join even at a time when plainly they weren't actually really ready and they didn't really meet all the regulations of the acquis communautaire. So the European Union is very likely to be favourable, and I think that's the key. That's the lead which most people will follow. An awful lot of so I don't think you should underestimate. I think the Black Lives Matter thing has brought it maybe a little more to public attention. I think we underestimate the level of resentment of the UK and of the British Empire among the political elites in many developing world countries, particularly in Africa, but also in places like India. And every time they get the chance internationally to give the UK a good kicking, such as over the Chagos Islands or even over the Falklands, Malvinas, they do give the UK a good kicking. So I think they're going, as long as the EU is on side, I think the bulk of nations are going to be well placed to back us. I feel reasonably confident that the position of the United States is going to be interesting. The US doesn't command many other states. The US has become increasingly diplomatically isolated. And at the UN, the UK and US are now in a group with sort of Brazil, Hungary, Australia, and a couple of others, and on a whole variety of motions, on the Chagos Islands, on Israel, and on other matters, that tiny group of states tend to be isolated standard, and they're all right-wing populist governments. But on Scottish independence, it would be, the United States, of course, its entire founding myth is on fighting for independence from the UK. And there'd be a very great deal of popular support in the United States for Scottish independence. And it might be difficult for an American government to go against that if it wanted to.
Right. First of all, Craig, thank you very much for that talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is that recently there was talk of changing the constitution by Boris Johnson. Now, I have been very nervous about the fact that they might actually close down our Scottish government. Is there any realistic intention of that, do you think?
I don't rule it out. I doubt it, because it would be a huge step to take. But I think certainly they'll do everything possibly they can, as we've already seen, of course, in relation to the legislation on powers coming back to the UK from Brussels, where they use that legislation not only not to devolve powers or back to Scotland that were coming from Brussels, but also to claw back power in some areas which Scotland already had. And I think almost certainly we will see further clawbacks. We see even today, we see Grant Shapps claiming that the Scottish Parliament has been holding up people's ability, Scottish government's been holding up people's ability to jet off on COVID-filled airplanes and go on holiday. But why anyone wants to get on an airplane at the moment is completely beyond me. But and the sort of continual political attack on the principle of devolution is there, and I perfectly understand why that fuels your fear. A lot of it would depend on the Tories got very little to lose in electoral terms in Scotland, and Johnson's shown that he really doesn't care about the interests of the Scottish Tories. A lot of it depends on how such moves would play with the English electorate. If Johnson thought it was going to be popular in England and winning votes in England to abolish the Scottish Parliament, then he'd probably do it. But my expectation is we will see further moves to reduce the power of Holyrood, make it less relevant. But I doubt they'll actually move to abolish it. But I don't rule anything out.
I was curious about the current leadership in the SNP, which does not show a lot of zeal for independence. In fact, Nicola Sturgeon has said she wants to focus on fighting COVID and put Indy on the back burner. That hasn't stopped Boris Johnson, of course, from pursuing a hard Brexit. So I'm just wondering if a change in SNP leadership is something that we might need to put some more bold leadership back into the top of Scottish government. And someone like Joanna Cherry, personally, I think would be an excellent choice. But that also leads to the question of the Alex Salmond affair, what's going on within the SNP, and whether you think that is feasible, or where your thoughts might lie in this area.
I personally was very disappointed in Nicola's lack of focus on independence long before COVID happened. And we should recall that when Boris Johnson vetoed or announced that he would not agree to a Section 30 order, that was long before everything was shut down by COVID. Mm-hmm. And Nicola's failure to come up with any real response to that, other than saying, well, okay, give me another mandate and we will ask again after the next Holyrood elections, wasn't a result of COVID. That was it's not COVID that's forced her not to be focused on independence. She already wasn't focused on independence, and this is where I have worries that the SNP as a party has become, and I'm still a member of the SNP. I think maybe they don't know that, which is why they haven't thrown me out. Maybe they haven't noticed, but I am still a member. I think the SNP has become much too managerial and too focused on governing from Holyrood within the devolution settlement, and not enough focused on independence. It's become more of a devolution party than an independence party in many ways. And I can understand that. You know, psychologically, you can perfectly well understand that they're thinking that what they are doing is mitigating the bad effects of the union. They're making things a bit better in Scotland. They're running things a bit better. They're making ordinary people's lives better day to day. They've done a better job than Westminster has in COVID. And all of that is true. But there's a real danger then of losing the urgency of the goal of independence. And I do think they are insufficiently focused on the goal of independence, and over-focused on peculiar distractions. And I think strangely enough, I'm actually the only person I know who's in favour of the Gender Reform Act. I don't know anyone else who is, but I'm actually very open to trans rights and self-identification, just as a very liberal person. I just think on freedom grounds, I'm quite happy to go along with that. But why on earth, so much of the SNP has allowed itself to get distracted by that question? If you ask me, to rate independence and that on a scale of current importance as issues, then I couldn't put them on the same scale. Why on earth is the Scottish government waffling on about those kind of things? Why are they? I would far rather they were focused far more on independence. And I do think we need a different leader to take us to independence. I think Nicola has done a very good job during the COVID crisis. I really do. And I think she has some remarkable strengths. But those remarkable strengths appear to be principally managerial. And I don't think she's the inspiring leader who can take the country to independence. And there's a real dilemma here, because how do you measure success? Does success consist in keep winning elections and keeping the SNP in power, which is an extremely good political leader, or does it lie in actually getting independence, at which she's a rather lax political leader, it appears? Although, I mean, I see the argument that the opinion polls are creeping up and up and up for independence, but I don't actually think that's Nicola's doing. I think that's to do with the disintegration of the UK state. And I should say, I personally think that if we all sat on our hands and did nothing, I think the UK state is going to fall apart as an entity anyway, for all kinds of other reasons. But our best hope as a nation is to escape that and get out of it, and have Scotland as a modern entity, not part of a crumbling empire. I'm sorry, that was a rather rambling. And yes, personally, I would put Joanna Cherry in charge of the movement tomorrow. I think Joanna's a brilliant person, intellectually brilliant, an astute politician, and far more focused on the goal of independence.
Do you think the Scottish people are up to the task of confronting Westminster if it becomes aggressive bringing up the army. I mean, these are big, serious questions. I mean, I think this is what would happen if Scotland declared independence. I think the Westminster would send the army up. I mean, how do you think the Scottish people are up to dealing with a situation like that?
Well, you've got, in the case of Slovenia, one thing that happened, of course, was that quite a lot of the Yugoslav army, and quite a lot, particularly of the officer corps of the Yugoslav army, was Slovenian. And so you got a situation where the Yugoslav army, units of the Yugoslav army weren't up for coming and firing on their own people. And you certainly would get, elements of that within the British army, and that's something which any Westminster government trying to send in the British army to Scotland in order to put down independence would have to consider. You don't have to win a military confrontation to be effective. It is generally agreed by historians that, and what if is always an impossible question to have but what if questions are impossible to answer definitively. But it is generally accepted that if at the time of the Easter Rising in Dublin, you'd had a referendum on Irish independence, it would have been lost substantially. The majority Irish population at the time was pro being in the United Kingdom. And it was the ruthless crushing of the Easter Rising actually was a massive boost to and led to Irish independence. If your ability to face up to your willingness to face up to tanks doesn't have to result in I'm not claiming we have superior ground forces to the British Army. We don't. But I'm personally, and maybe it's easier for people because again we're all a little bit older, and I'd be much happier for the British Army to run over me and kill me with a tank than I would for them to kill someone whose life is still before them. But your willingness to physically stand up to invasion by what would be foreign armed forces if we declared independence is more important than the immediate result. Let me put it that way. But yeah, no, I think the Scots are a martial race. We also have to consider, of course, and I should say my own view is that developments in the United Kingdom and the immediate economic pain of Brexit and the continued right-wing focus of a populist right-wing Tory government is, I think, going to accelerate popular opinion in Scotland. And I think we're going with the flow. I think the UK is falling apart anyway, and there's going to be, we'll be doing this, against a consensus of ever increasing support for Scottish independence, and I think that's quite important. But we should, of course, there will always be unionists. Well, we will see what happens after independence. My expectation is in almost every country no country that became independent from the UK, and we should remember, of course, there was a whole empire. There are about 80, 90 countries that became independent from the UK. Not one of them has ever wanted to go back. All of them at the time of independence had a substantial minority that was against independence and preferred its relationship with the UK. Those minorities in almost every case just disappeared over time, including in Ireland, of course. My own view is that unionists actually won't always be with us. Those people, there will still be Tories in an independent Scotland, but eventually Scots Tories will stop wanting to be part of Westminster. But whenever independence is declared, there will of course be a unionist minority who are against it, and that's not something we should pretend won't be the case.
I'd like to thank you first, Craig, for that talk, and I actually agree with what you're saying as far as what we should be doing now. I don't think it's going to happen. I just wondered, I'd seen recently Joanna Cherry had put forward some suggestion that there might be a legal argument for Scotland being entitled to have a referendum without UK approval, needing to go through the courts, and wondered if you had particular thoughts on that. And just as an aside, the recent indication of polls in England that 49% of Conservatives want England to be independent. Is there any way that we could just keep asking for more money from them and get that up to 60%?
I think it's actually quite interesting. One thing I do from time to time, and I don't recommend it because it's fairly toxic, but just to keep a sort of eye on public opinion, from time to time I go to the Daily Mail's website just to read the readers' comments and see what people are saying. And it's quite extraordinary, the belief, people in England believe the propaganda that they massively subsidise Scotland. And this, I wish the Scots would go away because then we won't have to pay for them anymore. Attitude is indeed widespread. Certainly, it's the kind of standard position of commenters on the Daily Mail. So the opinion poll didn't surprise me in that respect. I'm sorry. Could you just repeat? I've forgotten what was the question you were asking.
The first question was whether you thought the idea that Joanna Cherry had about trying to go the legal route would do any good.
Yeah, I think it would be good to do. I'm not actually convinced that they'll win the case in the Scottish court. The Scottish Parliament certainly has the legal right to hold referenda. Whether it has the legal right to hold referenda on a reserved matter is a tricky argument. It seems to me there's not a clear, definitive answer one way or the other, and I don't know which way the court is going to come down, even if it is only a consultative referendum. I think if they win that case, we should go ahead and hold that referendum. If it is only a consultative referendum, there is the danger the unionists will just seek to boycott it, and we'll have to see how that plays out politically. There's a danger in that too, of course, because if you get a high enough turnout, then the boycott becomes possibly counterproductive from their point of view. But no, I think it's useful for them to be pursuing that option. I'm not quite sure how far it will get. We'll see how it goes. But I noticed that only about a week ago, I think, Joanna came out for the first time, I think, in support of the Plan B option of using the Holyrood elections as a kind of referendum. And I was very pleased because we've now, support for that option is now building within important people within the SNP, and that's a good thing.
I know that the future is difficult to predict, but my best current guess at how independence will be covered by the 2021 Holyrood election is that the election will not be a plebiscite on independence, but will instead be a vote for or against yet another mandate for an independence referendum. If the Holyrood Parliament gets that mandate, then it will, as far as I can see, start off by asking the UK government nicely for another Section 30. If this is not forthcoming, and it might take a while for it to not be forthcoming, because I'm sure they'll spin it out for as long as they can. So if it's not forthcoming, then according to Pete Wishart, the Scottish Government will then seek international support and support of the EU to hold this referendum. If this happens, do you think that this might get us independence? Or is the referendum road very definitely a cul-de-sac?
I can't see a route to where the EU supports a referendum. I mean, I was talking about votes at the United Nations on recognition of a state, and that's an accepted legal process. There's no process for giving EU support to a referendum. I mean, the EU could issue a statement saying we support a referendum, and Boris Johnson will say, that's the EU, we've left the EU, I hate the EU, who cares? And that's how that will play out. And that's just as practical as asking for a Section 30 order. It's just not going to get anywhere. And Pete Wishart seems to be a sort of factory for churning out means of doing nothing while appearing to do something, and that comes to me in that. But I agree with you. I think what you are saying is where the SNP leadership is heading. I'm genuinely having doubts. You know, if the SNP is not prepared to say if we win, if the SNP is going to fight the next Holyrood election on the basis of we need to win to get another mandate for a referendum, I'm genuinely having doubts about whether I'd want to go out delivering leaflets for them, because why? It's becoming pointless, and then of course we get to the whole question of having a, whether it's a good idea or not to have a second list party taking a more radical stance on independence, and that second, a new party has been formed, and there will be a second list party. Whether enough people of any prominence will join it for it to garner enough votes to have any effect, I don't know. My intention is to try to generate, and I do honestly believe. I was going to be now on a speaking tour of Scotland had coronavirus not happened, talking to meetings exactly like this one, and I'd lined up 30 or 40 engagements, and that wasn't the end. That was the beginning when coronavirus hit and put paid to it, so the tour didn't happen. But the majority of those engagements were where I'd been booked by SNP branches to go and talk to them, and there seems to me genuinely a mismatch between opinion of ordinary members of the SNP and where the leadership are. I was saying that Nicola's disappointing response to the refusal of the Section 30 came before COVID. We shouldn't forget that the cancellation of the SNP Spring Conference came before COVID also. And in my view, that was to avoid a backlash about the lack of action towards independence. COVID now gives an excuse for cancelling the autumn conference. And there seems to be a lack of an ability for the discontent being felt by members to get fed in within the party machinery. And the party machinery in particular, not the elected MPs and MSPs so much for some of those, but the people employed in the party machine seem to me especially unrepresentative of the rest of the party. And I feel the leadership has become isolated from the views of party members and perhaps scared of the views of party members. And I've got no more right to talk on this than you do, and my view is worth no more than yours. But that's where I think we are.
Can I ask, on behalf of the group, if they don't mind, what we can do, what we as a group can do to counteract the subtle and sometimes not so subtle bias of the mainstream media?
That's a good question. And it's very difficult. 10 years ago, when I used to get asked that question, I used to wax lyrical about the internet and new media and how it was going to change everything, and we were going to be able to counterbalance the old and disappearing media through social media, in effect. That's not really happened. The sort of democratization of media hasn't really happened as well as I would have liked. Oh, I should say, in terms of things that the SNP does sometimes which annoy me, the one that's annoyed me most lately was the decision to give £3 million to newspapers to stop them going bust. Because I think one of the best things that could happen to Scotland would be if the majority of newspapers went bust in this country, because they're awful. I mean, they're not owned by paupers who need the money, and they're dreadful. Majority of them just dreadful machines of unionist propaganda. Why on earth we are subsidising them, I have no idea whatsoever. Sorry, that was a digression. The social media is helpful. I mean, all those little things like, replying to newspapers with comments, sending letters to newspapers, having your own blog, being active on Facebook, being active on Twitter. All of that helps to an extent. It's all better than nothing. But our ability to counter the continual level of bias of mainstream media is limited. It really is limited. One of the things that worries me, my own blog, for example, though it has a very wide readership, the majority of readers come to it through Twitter or Facebook. And both Twitter and Facebook are increasingly subject to political censorship. And I find if I put out a tweet on Israel-Palestine, for example, that tweet always has far less of a reach and is basically suppressed on Twitter, though not on Facebook, interestingly enough. I get no difference in the volume coming in from Facebook, but I do get about 10% of the volume coming in from Twitter that I do generally. If I get on to Palestine, there are other examples I could give as well. But social media is not as democratic a platform because it now has these gatekeepers, which are of course big US corporations, and the internet developing in that way is quite is quite a problem. It is good. I mean, if you trust in the BBC has definitely fallen substantially, and there are opinion polls that measure that, and it appears to me to have fallen. And I haven't seen an opinion poll which specifically measures this. It would be interesting to see one. Trust in the BBC seems to have fallen far harder in Scotland than it has in the rest of the of the UK, and that's important. I think counteracting the narrative is important. It's quite difficult sometimes to go against the received opinion. In particular, it's not always easy to tell. It's not always socially easy to tell people that what the BBC is saying about the Scottish economy is mince. But I think it behooves all of us all the time to not shy away from those conversations with people who aren't necessarily inclined naturally to agree with us, and just try to get people to look at things a different way. So I don't have a magic bullet. I do advise everyone to be as active as they can be on social media, including if you're on Facebook, just putting up, rather than merely putting up photos of cats or pot plants or whatever, occasionally just writing down your political thoughts that day in your status and clicking it so that your friends see it. It's quite interesting. It's still the case even now, and that my sister is much more respectable than me finds this, that there are social circles where people are still quite shocked to discover that people they know who they view as respectable support Scottish independence, and just making sure you let people know that you do, and that they know where you stand can also be helpful. So it's a whole variety of small actions that we can take in order to counter the propaganda. But there's not anything. I can't come up with anything drastic that individual members can do. Attending meetings like this is great. It's really extremely helpful for people to interact socially directly in the way we're doing. But I'd also say, having said that, I'm very much against the Scottish Government support for newspapers. We also have to think what happens after independence. I wouldn't actually want to have a state broadcaster that behaves like the BBC but is pro-Indy. We're not trying to just take over the organs of the British state and use them to our advantage. I think we need to have a fundamental rethink of what a state broadcaster is and how it behaves. I think that the BBC is a prime example of how not to do it in the continued bias of its presenters and things. So just replicating that institution in an independent Scotland, I don't think is what we want to do. And I personally, I'd be quite radical. I'd break up the BBC. I'd probably do more of the state-sponsored broadcasting through independent companies commissioned by Creative Scotland or another institution that's not the BBC or the SBC or whatever we call its replacement, for example. I'd look to ways you can have more community involvement in news. So there are all kinds of other issues there to look at going forward once we become independent. And that's something I'm very keen we do throughout the entire debate, which is start thinking less and less about what's happening within the UK and more about how do we want this to work after independence, because I genuinely believe we're going to be after independence sooner than people expect.
Go over to Mary and ask her to do the vote of thanks.
Yes, thanks very much, Craig, for coming along. We had huge interest in your talk, more than we've ever had for any of our, and we have meetings all the time with guest speakers. So thanks for coming along. You've given us quite a bit of optimism from life's not all about Section 30. I don't think any of us really thought that anyway, but you've given us more ideas for beyond that. And could also say to people, if you don't mind me giving you giving a puff for a book, if any of you still have illusions about the UK government's support for human rights in corrupt and tyrannical regimes, then read Craig's memoir of his time, Murder in Samarkand. You can get it on Amazon, you can get it in Kindle. It's really, really worth reading, and it's an eye-opener to anyone who still has illusions about that. I don't know if that applies to any of us. I never had any, but maybe some of you still do. Shatter them by reading Murder in Samarkand. And thanks very much, Craig, for coming along. We've all benefited a whole lot from that. I just wish that we could get some more people to come along, or unionists, or even people who are doubtful about it and open to be convinced. But it's really hard to get them to come along to meetings like this. But hopefully, sooner or later, the soft no voters will come along, and I'm sure they'll all be swept away by your talk and your answers that we've just heard today. Thank you again, Craig.